Hello, everyone. Welcome to Literary Nights with Unsolicited Press. I am your host, Rosalia Scalia, and tonight we are here with four authors who will read from their published or forthcoming works. Let's meet David Nash, Rebecca Rolland, and Carolina Cabada. Another author might be joining us. Her name is Beth Bergmeyer. So if she comes in, we will all know. But we're going to start with Rebecca. Rebecca, can you tell us a little bit about your book, what inspired it, and do what you're reading?
Sure, thanks. Thank you. I'm excited to read tonight. So, my name's Rebecca Rowland, and I write mostly lyric poems. They have to do with subjects about the natural world and especially about how personal experience translates to kind of the external world as well. So, sort of like how we're making the personal externalized. And part of what I reflect a lot on is experiences of motherhood, childbirth, child rearing, and marriage, and other relationships. So I'm always really thinking about the arc of relationships and authenticity in relationships. So that's basically what I tend to write about, and I'm happy to read or to continue on if we want to do introductions first.
No, I think you could go read, and then we'll talk as each author
Okay.
comes to their turn. Yeah. So do your reading, and I'm excited to hear about that.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right. So the first poem I'm going to read is called Presence. Bring on the unborn, the as yet unreleased. Let this body's sand trap convex, turn mechanism. Let throat's base beat gold with the threat of steeped branches, bleeding, tired till the hash of rain no longer treads lightly, thrushes hunger fallowly abroad, chest thrums, tree canopies lashing in hurricane winds out the window. Domestic bliss? No. Pockets of evening menace, oiled scallions, roots catalyze this pot into ash, this pan into battle cry, banging ceasingly the steel cut edge. Let knees be a flicker of over, feet find light sleep under ribs, feet treading the meadow in the hip of presence, angled forward till only grass, only field rot finds blooms. Now hearkens, multiplies to 1,000 entitlements of solitary leaves. For once commands gather forces, smack trouble, smatter darkness into the inner ear. So that's
Nice.
my first poem. And
Okay.
maybe just a couple more.
Okay. Sure.
Okay, great. So the next poem I want to read is called What Survival Meant. Wind stirs the book of dalliances, the first lines lost. Husband finds his body strengthened, lover lost. Drained, we wake to cloudless sky, coupled, leafless. Bad weather stops our burnt lungs, rained out, lost. Symbols, red lights signal this land's unhinging. Don't listen, we shout to Ursinus, maps we've lost. Pebbles chart sidewalks, birches drop bark like hints. Bicyclists cross our cul-de-sac. You call, get lost. Look, I respond. I touched him once, but never after. Will I forever be the blamed one, claim I'm lost? Solitude meets the mind, later the gut. Thank God for silent dinners, recipes even the best book lost. I've stirred enough and learned enough of winter. Its pickled sticks, its Mozart, music, its songbirds lost. Needing you was what survival meant. It came well packaged, need and aftermath, wicked fire. We're lost, I cried twice over, stalled. But you didn't try pretending. Not in this charade, a poker game lost. You have all you need for tomorrow? The ex lover asks. In her garden, I gather sweet stones, scout the lost. Cry, don't go back. I overleapt limbs, jigged mazurkas. Believe me, light inside was nothing like light I lost. Thanks. So
Is
maybe
there
do I have
another?
time? One more poem?
Sure,
Okay.
you do.
Okay, sounds good. Let's see. So I am going to read a poem that is called And Yet Resounding. In darkness, we're human containers of resounding, unspeakable grief that finds us braceleted, entombs us, won't retreat. In darkness, our need for escape sizzles. In pots with flecked eggs, we still smell. In spark riddled trains, commuters locked in sear light, shade striping the passenger sides, resplendent in the mind's chinoiserie before evening collapses on us. We fight against visible moons, lose tickets in conductorless cars, each man a shadow, as landscapes plain open to greenwood glory, each woman rehashing bodies recoil, lingering in birth light as we might, its bookend death once again. River irrigates the insistent song. One errant rock diverts the path. 3,000 years sleep in the heat of deepest earth. Air will be clamored for, battled over, breeding unnecessary death.
Very nice. You have a few more minutes, and then because you're going to be leaving early, we could do the Q&A with you before you leave.
Oh, sure. Should we go
Okay.
ahead and do that?
Sure, sure. You have a couple more
Oh,
minutes.
okay. So yeah, I can read one more poem perhaps, and then
That
we
would
can
be
do the
great.
Q&A. Okay, sounds perfect. Great. So I would like to read a poem called Storm. As if the makeshift house had finally flattened, instantiation of another undimming light, wind scavenging insulation, eaves, locked ease already splitting to blared motion, nattering deafness, the ears split rind, racking flex, mallowing past haunches, wresting fallow seed from fractured pools. Spent, we trap no more than ordinary tornness, bleached blousing cast from scoured ties. Soon we sweep the field on hands and knees. What's left, what mechanism, each casement individual, reduced. Not everything can be rescued, undermined. Not every stake rises automatically. Exclamations sunder, even copper crusts over, oxidizes, contains the last of what it will not contact. Banisters flushed to dead wood. Consider us no riven specimens, no filters scattered to contorted dust. The wake of us, the wreck we hardly see. Even birdsong flails as bricks tumble to earth. Even crossbeams meeting in branchlight, mazing forward, blister, unwillingly break.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you for reading. And so I want the other authors to join in too if you have any questions or comments. But how did you come to start writing about the authenticity of childhood, motherhood, child, all of that? How did you come to that?
Yeah, so I've been writing poems for many years, but I think especially as I and friends have undergone those kind of experiences, I realize there's just such a complex mix of emotions, I think, that are often not talked about. And especially sort of a sense of violence and sense of difficulty inherent in some of those experiences. And I think a lot of times we kind of talk over those or we generalize about those kind of experiences, but I think it's very hard to pull out the nuances. And so for me, that was kind of a challenge, but it also felt very emotionally urgent at the time.
Given the climate these days, it still feels emotionally
Yes,
urgent.
yes, yes, exactly.
Yeah. So, talk a little bit about your writing process. Do you write every day? I don't know if everyone here is a parent. I know I am, and I know how to juggle writing with child needs. So, how do you? What is your writing process?
Yeah, so I try to write every day. It doesn't always happen, but I try. I like to think about it just as kind of touching the writing in some way every day, whether it's writing or thinking about what I've been writing or editing, just sort of having some connection to it. Because I think otherwise, I think we can get a little bit disconnected from what we're working on. I also write. Some people, someone asked me like, I tend to write really fast, but I think it's because I'm sort of mostly writing in my head. And then when I go, I think about writing is just typing out what was already in my head. So it's almost like it's percolating, even if I'm doing something totally different. And then when I get to the page, I just kind of like, spit it out. So also a lot of drafting, I think. So if I even have a few minutes, I try to look at something and see if I can make it just a little bit better, or a little bit more precise.
I noticed a lot of nature in your poetry. So, are you using nature as a metaphor to speak for the emotion, or do you feel like it's part of the cycle of life? Like, how did it come to be where there's a lot of nature and
Hmm.
and
Yes.
winter and all of those metaphors in your poetry?
For sure. Yeah. So I grew up actually in Georgia in a very natural environment, I would say. And I think I continue to be really drawn to the natural world as sort of a reflection of our emotions and emotional expression kind of made visible. So for me, it is both metaphor and also reality, as I often find a lot of solace in nature and in water and swimming and seasons and things like that. So I think, yeah, I think especially as poets, it's important to be attentive to the natural world. And I find a lot of
Mhm.
inspiration there. So kind of some of both, I would say.
Well, and symbolism, water has a lot of meaning, especially in nature, but also in the human emotion, and also with motherhood. You know,
Yes.
it's water. So does Caroline and David, do you have any questions for Rebecca?
Uh, Dave, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask, like, what is that? Poetry is so hard for me. So uh, when I listen, I sort of wonder what the editing process is like for you. I feel like there's so much flexibility in prose, but poetry, I just it seems it's really hard for me. So like, how does that when you edit? Like, do you have a goal in mind or like an
Mhm.
approach of how you are you trying to cut things or just nuance or like how does that work for you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, especially because now I've been writing both fiction, and I write nonfiction as well, but fiction and poetry, and I think it is a really different process of editing.
Yeah.
I think with fiction I have a better sense of feeling like, oh, in a novel, like X doesn't, needs to lead to Y, and so I need to
Hmm.
get there in some coherent fashion. Whereas with poems, it kind of feels to me more like painting, like a sense of kind of condensing and enriching, but not maybe making it. If you do too much, you're going to make it just a brown mess,
Yeah.
so in sense of like, you want to make sure that the colors are still clear, and it's not as smudged as maybe it could be if you kind of
Mm.
overdo it. So yeah, I think I have to be in a certain mindset. I'd be curious about what everyone else thinks too. But it definitely feels like a less like workman-like process, and more sort of a sense of going in and carefully chipping away or condensing or changing
Mm.
words.
Interesting. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Anybody
and I,
else?
sure, yeah. And first of all, thank you for those wonderful poems. I actually, our work seems to be in conversation because, well, you'll see. But I was really curious, especially with that last poem, "Storm." The use of we and the first person plural, and I'm curious about if you could talk a little bit more, perhaps, about point of view in poems, or what you sort of think about. Um, like the like who is the speaker of a poem, and sort of like, I guess opinions on like, are your poems always spoken by you, or are they different personas, things along those lines. So.
Yes, that's a great question. And actually, it's funny because I think when I teach poetry and I read some of my poems, and people make assumptions, obviously, about who I am as a person, or what my experience has been like and things like that. And I definitely think that it's important to remember that for me at least, I'm not always identifying myself with all of these experiences. So for me, some are imagined personae, or imagined persona, and are not necessarily saying, oh, I did this, or this was my ex-husband, or this was whatever. Because I don't think that we need to be sort of so literally, tied to our autobiographical facts in making poems. I think it's much more interesting and much more pleasurable to be able to imagine arcs for ourselves that are not, what our lived experiences have been like. At the same time, I think it's also important to connect emotionally with it. So I wouldn't want to write something where I didn't feel in some way that I could be that, or that might, be a part of me. So I think just sort of as we're thinking about the different parts of ourselves and maybe longings or things that we would have wanted to be, but we haven't been, to be able to write into that, I think is really powerful and something I strive to do, without feeling like, oh, I have to have been this person. So I think I always caution people to, like, it's not necessarily always me, but it is me emotionally. I think otherwise I wouldn't want to be writing it. So I don't know if that helps.
It does. I think a lot of writers can resonate to that. So thank you very much, Rebecca, for sharing your work
Thank
with
you.
us.
Yeah, thank
we're
you for
going
the
to move
great
on.
questions.
Yeah, we're going to move on to Carolina. And so, Carolina, you want to go ahead? And we will know if Rebecca needs to drop off. She has another engagement following. So thank you so much for joining us, and we won't be bothered if you need to drop
Thank you. I
off. All
appreciate
right.
it.
Thank you. All right. So, Carolina, can you tell us about your work? It sounds very interesting already about the so
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. And, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to read here. Thank you, Rosalia, for organizing these. This is already a great conversation. And I'm really excited for the rest, for David's reading as well. So I'll be reading from my forthcoming collection of poems, which is titled True Stories. And these poems, I started writing this collection 2018, 2019. And I was really writing a lot about several tropical storms, hurricanes, typhoons that I have sort of either personally witnessed or have, touched my life in some way. And so I was writing poems about tropical storms. And then 2020 happened, and the onset of the pandemic and lockdown, and sort of throughout those early months of the pandemic, started writing about it as the same way that a lot of folks wrote about the pandemic. And then I started noticing that there were a lot of similarities between how I was writing about those natural disasters and how I was writing about the pandemic, and then decided to start playing around with that, start putting them together, and figuring out some ways that they could all be in conversation with one another. And so then that's where the collection as a whole came forth. And so for tonight, I'll read a few poems. A few of these have been published previously, but 2 of them have not been published anywhere or even read anywhere. And so I wanted to share them with you all here. So that's that. So this first poem that I'll read is called Waking Up During a Storm. And this was originally published in Unpublishable Zine. So, east wind changes. Lightning illuminates the bedroom wall. Thunder smacks skin, rumbles, soothing after. Night passes, at this rate, sieves through eyelids, gone with the gentle grumbles of an empty stomach. This too shall pass. With sunrise come shadows and graying light, thinned by tiny water drops gaining mass into another thunderhead. It might break on this great plain or travel on wind to the mountain, but days will be long dark, sunshine found in cups, robins determined to outsing the gloom. A calendar mark to remember another day is gone. The year passes and always feels so long. Okay. And this next poem is one of the so far unpublished poems that's going to be forthcoming in the book, and it is titled Nocturne. But does the day really start if I can't get out of bed? I haven't slept right for weeks. Golden hour is the only time I'll look at the world I was meant to light Everything is gorgeous from an angle. Even a crash is softer on the bias. I'm tired of my duty. The sky looks better dappled in faraway stars, ripples of dust in a dark beam reverse engineering. Maybe the daytime is overrated. Maybe the night year is here. Maybe there's a word for a god somnolence specifically. In the end, the world forces a turn. And this next poem is called Behind Smudged Glass We Sat, and this was originally published in Front Porch Review. Behind smudged glass we sat, watching hawks and shadows. Sunset lights the underside of glide wingspan golden, to be hollow-boned, feathered, flicker yellow, swooping fast on gale winds, rattling human windows. Two birds circling, seeming to hover, flap only to course correct, grow closer than further. We sat, pointed fingers as they turned around maple boughs that shed seeds in the summer. Here, hunger pivots for a kill, and sunset paints glass fingerprints redder still. And this next one, and my second to last one, is also an unpublished poem that's part of the collection, and it's called Futile Denial. Weather app says snow in April, hour by hour, waiting between all four seasons of the Northern Hemisphere's year. Gray snowbanks blur, refuse to refuse joy dripping from leaves despite ruined plans for tree plantings for spring. To let that future gray despair forecast its shadow in reverse, to give up like it's futile is its own kind of denial, because who knows, maybe this year will be direct, a doe's gaze pre-flight. This year will be frank, freezer-burned brown grass, will be melting snow, a fiercer feeling than hope. Okay. And this last one is called A Final Supper, and this was originally published in the Orchard's Poetry Review. If the summer blaze persists until my judgment day, I won't pray for another winter. I'll spread my body out on fry pan cast iron, then roll to the other side and cook even. Already golden, the skin can still be browner, more toothsome. I hunger for char and am emboldened to hold my barbecue for a ransom. No one should feast on my body but me. I shouldn't sacrifice my first life for non-believers. Forgiveness isn't free. When given a taste, the greedy ask more of me. With hope, I try to rescue, yet refusing, they sink in the watershed. And that's what I have.
Thank you so much. That was very powerful. So we're going to do the question and answer for you and David after you both read. So David, would you like to tell us a little about In Wells Time, and also do your reading?
Sure. So yeah, my book with Unsolicited Press is called In Wells Time. It's a fiction novel, and it came out in early February. So it's actually out there, and it's in that sort of funny spot where there was like a lot of like, yay, lots of things, and now it's kind of quiet. So I think maybe people are reading it. I don't know. Hopefully. But it's a story about a family kind of trying to understand their recently passed away brother and son, who sort of was lived a life that they didn't really know much about, and they kind of learned that through a journal that he left behind. They learn about this sort of gift / curse that he and they all have in their blood, just their ability to kind of hold on to moments in time and experiencing them a little bit longer. But kind of ask the question of, is there a cost to that? And the idea was just to explore, what do we do with our time and how can we be intentional with the time that we have? So I'll just get into the reading. I think I started writing it several years ago after having one of these wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding kind of. I got lost in a thought of thinking about space and time and endlessness and all those big things. So this might, I'm gonna read quick because I want to keep it to that 10 minutes. So, get out! A door slammed, cutting off Monica's piercing voice. Downstairs, Margaret sipped her cup of coffee and rolled her eyes up to the shouts above her. The bickering was the staple of the summer. No matter how much Margaret tried to separate Wells and Monica, they always found their way back into one another's spaces. It was almost as if they needed the confrontation, or possibly found satisfaction somewhere between the screams and reprimands. It wasn't as if it was simply a case of the younger sibling needling the older. Monica also frequently made a point to go out of her way to irritate Wells. Give it back! Wells' voice carried down the stairs, along with the pounding of his fist on his oldest sister's door. Margaret heard the rattling of her son as her son tried the locked doorknob. The retort was muffled, but Margaret was pretty sure this time it was about a CD or a Discman or something of that nature. Monica must have taken back what she thought was rightfully hers. It's amazing what goes missing while you're off to college and your siblings have free reign over your unguarded belongings. It's also amazing how quickly you forget the thing you were borrowing does not actually belong to you. You guys, stop, please. Wells, here, you can borrow my headphones. Heather's voice had found its way in between her brother and the door. Just as much as Wells and Monica felt compelled to torture one another, Heather saw it as her duty to rescue her siblings from total annihilation. Sometimes she'd be drawn to tears by how strongly she felt they all needed to get along. Margaret picked up a slice of toast and took a bite. She let the drama unfold a little longer, giving her children a chance to solve the battles on their own. It was times like these that she often remembered something her mother would say to her when she fought with her own brothers. Maggie, my job as your mother is to love, support, and guide my children, not to rescue them. I leave that responsibility to God and the brave little voice deep inside each of you. As much as she hated it at the time, for she could remember just as many slammed doors during her childhood, she had grown to emulate her own mother's style of parenting and decided this was a moment to keep it alive. They fight a lot. Leslie sat at the table next to Margaret and swallowed another spoonful of oatmeal. Yes, sweetie, they do, but they also love each other. This is delicious. Margaret smiled at her youngest daughter. What do you think? Should I go up there and put a stop to all that shouting? I don't know. Do you want a bite of my oatmeal? Leslie held up a spoon of the mushy breakfast. I'm okay, dear. You can have it. Leslie made the scoop disappear as the thuds of a 15-year-old boy clunked down the steps. Wells burst into the kitchen with a cloud of irritation wrapped around him like a blanket. Margaret's imagination conjured images of Pigpen from the Charles Schulz cartoons. Wells moved through the kitchen preparing a bowl of cereal. Each motion was exaggerated with a grumpy harumph. He sloshed the milk into the bowl and plopped down next to Leslie. Why does she even have to live with us? The words escaped through a mouthful of sugary cornflakes. Well, soon I expect she won't. But she's almost 20. I mean, come on, it's so lame. By 20, Wells imagined himself. Honestly, he had no idea what his life would look like, but because he didn't personally know any other 20-year-olds, but he was absolutely certain he wouldn't be living at home. He'd probably have a cool, fast car and be in a big, cool city where cool things happened all the time. He wasn't sure what those things would be, but they would be cool, very cool. We've been through this. She is saving money to help pay for school. Hospital volunteers don't get paid very much, you know. My guess is next summer she'll have a fancy job in the cities and you won't have to put up with her. Plus, it's only one more week and then she's back at her classes. And besides, the rest of you start school tomorrow, so you'll barely be around each other. I want a fancy job. It sounds fun. Leslie seemed unfazed by the negative energy following her brother like a storm. Doesn't it? Margaret smiled at her bright ray of sunshine. She was pretty sure she saw Wells smirk too. He always had a soft spot for his little sister. I can't believe you are starting second grade tomorrow. Wow. Leslie sat up straight with pride as her two sisters came down the stairs and Monica walked in first and glared at her brother. Mom, I need your help finding a few more boxes. I think I need all my books with me this semester. Haven't you already read them? What do you even need them for? Wells's words were heavy with snotty distaste for his sister. The MCAT, Wells. Do you even know what that is? Yeah, of course I do. Wells had no idea what it was, but he wasn't about to let his sister know. Monica eyed her brother and called his bluff. It's the medical college admissions test, and it's probably the most important test I'll take ever. You see, some of us have goals and plans, Wells. Not all of us are just floating through life, playing with cameras, kicking soccer balls, screwing around with silly friends, and letting the clock tick away. He glared at his sister, stuffed his empty bowl and spoon in the dishwasher, and walked out of the kitchen. Mom, I'll be at Derek's. He slammed the door without looking back. Good riddance. Monica, that's enough. Margaret now wondered if she'd let it go too far. You're going to be late for the hospital. I know you two don't see eye to eye, but I'd like you to try to be kind for one more week. I've tried, Mom. He's always in my space. Everything he does, or more like doesn't do, annoys every fiber in my body. Margaret let out a long sigh and chose not to engage. All right, Leslie. We've got to get you to the pool. There's supposed to be thunderstorms this evening. So now is our shot. Not many days of swimming left, I'm afraid. Heather, do you want to join us? Yeah, that sounds good. Ashley and Carolyn might be there too. Margaret turned to Monica, who was putting on her volunteer badge for the local hospital. Monica was inspecting her reflection in the mirror near the door to the garage. She was careful to make sure the badge was smudge-free and perfectly positioned above her heart. You look great, honey. We're really proud of how hard you work. All of our kids. You each have such special talents. Seeing her daughter's eyebrows raise with skepticism, Margaret continued, yes, even Wells has his gifts. Sometimes it just takes a little longer for each of us to find them. Whatever you say, Mom. Love you. Monica grabbed her bike helmet, walked out of the door to the garage, leaving the happier of the Monosmiths to themselves. Margaret left a note on the counter for Wells and corralled Leslie and Heather to the garage to set off for the swimming pool. Wells spent the better part of the morning and the early afternoon brooding at Derek's house, trying to prolong the last day of summer vacation. Who was Monica to think she was so high and mighty? Where did she get off judging what I do with my time? He thought. It was true, he didn't invest nearly as much effort into school, and he'd much rather be taking pictures, playing soccer, or just about doing anything rather than sitting in a classroom with his sister. Later that night, he ate supper with his family, speaking as little as possible. The thunder rumbled in the background, and the lights in the house flickered as the storms lumbered through the river valley like giants taking a casual stroll, stopping to tap on a few houses here and there with their large electric clubs. Wells' mind wandered to his new digital camera. Photography was one of the few things he truly enjoyed. I'm going to stop there because it's getting long.
Very nice. Thank you both for reading. So, before I start with questions, I would like to give Rebecca a chance to ask any because I know her time is short. So, do you have any questions or comments, Rebecca? You're muted. You're muted.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you both for reading. Those were wonderful. I really enjoyed it and appreciate hearing from you. So, yeah, I guess just to start with David, because I was you just read. I was really curious about, especially the dialogue between the children. I just felt like it felt very authentic, and I was curious, kind of how you think about dialogue and how you kind of make it where it feels heightened, but not not overly long or anything like that.
Yeah, it's definitely something that has been a learning process for me. I know I know when I'm writing a character or trying to be in a scene, I'm really trying to imagine it, I guess, and put myself in it in a way, almost in a way where I'm really not thinking too hard about what I'm actually writing, but just trying to write what's happening, what I'm imagining, if that makes sense. And then I'll go through and cut a little bit. This last year or so, even before I did this, I know I started reading my first bits of Cormac McCarthy, and just like that, his approach to dialogue is so different. I mean, and I'm new to a lot of this stuff, but the idea of being able to have a conversation without a lot of with as few tether points for the reader as possible is really intriguing to me. If you can read, it's like watching a movie with subtitles. If you can sort of forget you're reading them, that's sort of a goal I think that I try and get to and continue to work towards. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's and each of these siblings has they're sort of different versions of myself, and so they have their own voice, and so I was trying to sort of pull that through with each.
That's great.
Piece.
No, thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. I also just had a question for Carolina also, if it's okay.
Sure.
Is that
No,
okay?
go ahead, ask.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious. I noticed that some of your poems rhyme at the end, and there's some off rhymes throughout. And I'm just kind of curious how you think about the sonic qualities of your poems and just about rhyming and off rhyming and that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I do tend to, I guess like when I first try to write a poem, I actually sort of default to sonnets and like having a sort of more formal rhyme scheme, just because I don't know, it's comfortable in a way, and it feels like it's a nice compact poem that I can work with. But then as I edit and as I change poems and as I sort of play around with like enjambment and figuring out where exactly I want the lines to end, I do try to read them aloud at least once just to see what they might sound like. Because I also like I found sometimes that if I try to purely just rely on what I think the words sound like in my head, then when I go to read them again, like, you know, weeks later, I'm just like, oh, this sounds completely off. Like the voice in my head has completely changed somehow in the weeks since looking at a poem. And so I think it's like a combination of, I have this form that's, you know, more formal that I start with for a lot of drafts, but then reading it aloud just sort of helps me sort of keep it, I don't know, keep it solid, like keep it sounding the same each time, even when I sort of step away from a poem for a long time. So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, and I really appreciate it. I'm sorry I have to sign off, but looking forward to seeing you later.
Thank you for joining us, and we hope that you will tune in every other Wednesday when we have our readings.
And thank
you
you
so much.
Thank
yeah.
you.
Nice to meet you.
Okay. So for David, I was actually also wondering how one of the things that's really tough as a writer is to get more than two characters in a room. And moving them around and also having them all speak. So I was going to say that was pretty impressive, and I was wondering like how you came to that scene, especially since it's the opening scene where you introduce all the characters, I'm assuming.
It's actually not that's chapter 10 in the book.
Oh, okay.
But well, it was very complex to write. Then it took me a while because the way it moves through, and actually right away is the book opens at a funeral, at Wells's funeral, and so you have all the siblings in there as adults, and their spouses, and so I had lots of interaction and like how do you introduce people, and then it's sort of everybody leaves the church and you kind of go in different cars. You know, so chapter 4 has sections of like, you know, Heather and her husband and Monica and Leslie is by herself, and they're kind of going off, and then they come back together at their parents' house, and it was more fun, a fun challenge. I wanted to write like kind of overlapping scenes from each person's perspective, and have kind of some misunderstandings in there too of, you know, assuming what the other person was meaning or intending, or why someone got up to leave a table and why not, you know, and what they're doing in the bathroom. And it was just it just became a fun sort of challenge. And visually, I thought about it like a movie, maybe, you know, what we would see in a scene like that, where everyone is shifting and changing, and who's the camera following and what's happening in the background, because there's a conversation there and do we get to hear it. So yeah, it was more of a fun thing that I just stumbled into, that I enjoyed trying to make it work and fit.
And Carolina, did you have similar technique challenges as you were writing your poems? I really especially liked the poems about the storms, so I was wondering how you were able to step into that energy where you're talking about, I mean, because storms could be violent, but they can also be cleansing. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like with the storm poems, I feel like I sort of wrote those poems sort of as those storms were happening also, which it was an interesting way to also distract myself, because like I'm not afraid of storms necessarily, but then sometimes they can get kind of wild. And sometimes I'm like, oh, is this window gonna break, or is this like, is something gonna happen? Like, there's always like a little bit of fear, I guess, whenever I am experiencing a storm, or whenever a storm is sort of passing over. And so I guess like I guess I try to really think about maybe what words might fit best the kind of energy that I'm trying to, um, the kind of energy that I'm trying to put out there, I guess, in a poem. Like, because especially as you said, like some poems, some poems, but also some storms can be very cleansing. Some storms can be very, soothing in a lot of ways. Storm sounds, the sort of like, white noise to fall asleep. But then, a lot of storms are also just extremely, devastating as well. And so it's almost like trying to also, bring in the earlier question too about, the sonic quality. It's like, okay, what words sound the best when I'm trying to think about devastation, or what words sort of sound the best when I'm trying to think about making this a more benign storm poem. And so a lot of that comes through with, I don't know, like almost just like reading the poems aloud over and over again, but then also just sort of like almost like pausing for a bit whenever I'm writing. I tend to also write by hand at first for my drafts. And so almost just like pausing and thinking, okay, what is actually the next word before I write it down? But I have a very different writing style, or sort of writing process. I tend to write very slowly, I think. And maybe in the time that it takes to think of the next word, then I find the right sound for the poem. I guess, does that answer the question? I kind of might have went off on a tangent. Yeah.
So no, it does. So do you write every day? Do you keep a journal? Like, what is your process?
I do keep a journal. Whether that counts as writing, it kind of like there are certainly words on the page, but then sometimes when I look back at them, I'm like, oh, I definitely wrote this when I was like pre-coffee, like pre-caffeine, pre-waking up. And so I do try to journal at least a little bit every day. And then I do tend to suddenly find myself almost like doing bursts of projects of like, I set myself a 30-day goal, and then I try to write, as much as possible during those 30 days. But then like the next 2 months, I just take completely off, and I'm like, well, I got to get back to it. I got to try again. So.
I was going to ask you, with the storms, how much does climate change factor into the storms? Because the storms that we've been having in the last few years have been kind of ragey.
Yeah.
So how much did climate change factor into your work?
Yeah,
I mean, because
absolutely.
the pandemic could be considered even with that kind of, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And the climate is definitely a constant subject, like at the front of my mind when it comes to these things. And especially when writing about storms, like I do think about the intensity. I also think about how a lot of the storms, or a lot of the sort of I guess storm behavior, is something that has happened in the past. Like, we've had superstorms before, like we've had really bad hurricanes, typhoons, like these disasters have happened. And to me, when I think about the storm specifically, and also climate change, I do think about that sort of recurring quality. I do think about the idea of, I guess, like, in a lot of environmentalist work, there's a lot of, think about the future generations who are going to inherit the planet. And then there's some part of me that's like, well, that future generation is grown up now. Like, that future generation is now, like, we are already seeing those things now. And so whenever I think about the climate, and whenever I try to write about the climate, that is certainly one of the things that I try to really emphasize, of like, we're already seeing the effects that people, 20, 30, 40 years ago were saying were going to happen. Like, aha, this is the world that we've built. And now, like, look upon it and notice when, these patterns come up. So yeah, absolutely. The climate's part of that.
So for both of you, it's kind of like with the climate change, and Wells, who has this curse and blessing where he could extend time. In a way, it sort of lends itself to a sort of dystopia. So, how do you keep yourself? Do you allow the work to go into that area, or do you hold it back and keep it into a more hopeful, lighter arena? So I guess David, can you start with that? Like, how did you get the idea of extending time? Because that's kind of like a paranormal thing, you know. And then how do you keep that from going into dystopia, or was dystopia kind of what you were going for?
Um, I guess. Well, let's see. I know it was sort of like magical realism, and I came up with like a genetic explanation. I tried to be like, well, how would this actually work if it was a real genetic thing, and how might that affect his whole family? And so I came up with explanations for that. And you see that throughout the book. I um, I think I wanted to be quite upfront with the idea that um, like you can't actually, even though wells can stop time, you can't actually stop time. Like and it and life still happens no matter what, and either you're a part of it or not. And if you are a part of it, you have an opportunity to decide um, how you play your part, to an extent, or at least, you know, to the best of your own ability. And so it's not a, I, I, I don't like writing sad endings or anything like that necessarily, and like real down things. I do like having. This was a book where I wrestled with this idea of how much closure do I put into the end of the book, and is there a positive point or not? And I do sort of. There is a conversation at the end of the book, um, where you have two characters talking, and one is saying, "Oh, this would work," and the other one's like, "No, like can't do this." And so I guess I tried to put as much realism into it, I guess, in a way of like, even though it's fantastical, in that way, which, um, so I don't know if that's dystopian or not, but that was how I decided to approach it. I do like things that are all tied up nice in a bow sometimes, and I do like that. And that's how my first book kind of ended. It went down really deep, but then it came back. And but I don't know. Yeah, that's that's my response. I'm not sure if that answers the question really well.
It's sure it's I mean it does. It's funny where ideas come from. And as you were speaking, I was wondering, what is the cost? What does Wells, for in fiction, for
Mhm.
every action there's a react, and
Mhm.
same in poetry. So what does Wells pay for having this gift? What is the reaction to the action?
Yeah,
It,
and
obviously he's gone, he's died, but
yep.
we don't know, you know. So was that part of the payment for the gift?
Yeah, I mean, I approached it as if, I thought of it honestly like an addiction, um, and like drug or alcohol abuse in a way, and that how that can be hard on your body. So I thought of a physical way, um, but also I think that there are emotional, um, there's some wins and some fun things, and there, like, he goes through a whole journey of it, um, as anyone would, given the keys to a, I don't know, brand new car and no rules, and you know jump on the autobahn and go, and like, so I try to let him explore that in all the fun ways, but then it also gets him in trouble in certain ways, and there's some, he scares himself and hurts some people that are who are close to him because of it, and so yeah, so I try to, without giving away too much, that's kind of how I.
Yeah, no. We definitely want people to be able to buy the book, to become
Yeah.
intrigued enough to buy the book. And Carolina, you want to talk about how writing about storms, um the similarities between writing about storms and writing about the pandemic?
Yeah, I think those similarities. I guess maybe the I remember. Sorry, I keep starting to answer this question over again. But I remember early on in the pandemic, a lot of folks were talking about how um, the disaster of the pandemic, is not like it was sort of exacerbating a lot of issues that were already present in a way. It was already, making worse or revealing perhaps the ways that, various systems have failed us, the ways that, people have failed each other. Like it's already like those ideas about the pandemic were circulating and were some of the things that I sort of was reading online early on. And because of that, it reminded me of similar discussions about disasters and disaster response and disaster uh, like disaster response is the word that's coming to mind, but um,
Like
that
emergency management, or is that what you were
yeah,
trying to do?
yeah. And this idea that I've also sort of come across of there's no such thing as a natural disaster, that the disasters are the various systems that have broken down because of the storm that has blown through, or, because of the wildfire that has started and has, grown out of control, or because of these various, like, it's not because of the storms necessarily that the disasters happen, but because the systems were not necessarily built or prepared for the sort of scale of the disaster, or the various responses weren't prepared to to scale up in that way. And so I guess it was just like noticing those similarities between the way that people talked about the pandemic and then the way that people have talked about climate change and other disasters that have come about because of that. That was sort of the thing that made me go, oh, these are not two separate collections that I'm writing, these are actually the same collection. And I think it was just like noticing those patterns and sort of like being attentive to, at the very least, like the people who are like, in my Twitter timeline and like, on in my social circles, a lot of my friends and family talk about climate change all the time. And so it was just sort of noticing the overlap, and then taking that a little bit further, taking that as far as I could go, I guess. So
Well, thank you both very much. It just shows you that inspiration for good writing and good literature can come from just anything that pertains to the human condition, whether it's, the magical realism or the paranormal skill of being able to stop time for just a few minutes or a few seconds, or a very real, frightening thing, climate change, which I think, a lot of people just like Greta Thunberg, we just want to wave and scream and shout for people to listen and hear. And sometimes truth with a capital T comes through more in literature than it does in reality. For some reason, people can relate to characters or persona narrators who are undergoing some dramatic trauma or storm or pandemic rather than real people in real life. So I'm going to close now, everyone, but I just want to make sure that everyone knows that our next reading is set for March 20th, and that's 5:30 Pacific time and 8:30 Eastern Standard Time. Also, all of these books, Rebecca's, she had to leave, but all of these books, David's and Carolina's, are available for order on the Unsolicited Press webpage, and that's www.unsolicitedpress.com. So we hope you do go over there and pre order these fascinating books. And with that, we're going to say goodnight, and we will see you on March 20th. Thank you all. Bye bye.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you for hosting.